Okay, cool. Well, hi everyone, welcome. I'm your moderator for today's conversation about lived experiences in adaptation intensive zones. So, we're going to start by having Danielle and Ronan present a little bit about this paper and what they're thinking about it. And then afterwards, we'll hear a discussion from Professors Laura and Faisal, and then we can have a Q&A and a broader discussion afterwards.
Yeah, thank you, Reka. So maybe I'll just take a while to share my screen. Okay, can you? Right. So hello everyone. Thank you very much, Raka, once again, and good evening from Bangladesh. As already Raka mentioned about our like session, the lived experience in adaptation zone. So today I'll be talking, me and Daniel will be talking about this. So beforehand, just to give the idea, like uh, actually adaptation, that is very common word to everyone who actually is working in the climate change arena, and we have been practicing adaptation like over 2 decades in the globally. We have invested a lot of money in adaptation process and adaptation interventions, and then again after 2 decades we cannot come up with the solution, and we cannot say that our adaptations are successful. Most of the time maybe it happens that in the project in the project report they have uh, flagged adaptation project as a successful, but after the project ends we we see that they they are failed to sustain in a longer run. So this is the like question that to actually were resonating in our head, and because we found out the lives of the local people are constantly being shaped and reshaped by the motion of these adaptation measures, and sometimes in the ways that conflicts with their values, tradition, beliefs, and worldviews. So uh, to uh, to understand more about this thing, we came up with a research team consisting of 4 people. So in that case, I wanted to give a little backstory, like how we came up with this team. So it's actually back then 2020 when I was studying in Kulna University. I was doing my postgrad and I started working with Danielle while Danielle was doing her PhD in Kulna division. Uh, so I met Danielle over there and we started working together. On the way, I also met Raka in the same place in Bosho Resort. And then again, I met Dave. I worked with him as well as a research assistant. He was doing his master's thesis at that time on non-economic loss and damage, focusing on the coastal area. So we all actually met in the same place in coastal area. Uh, and since then, we started thinking about our how we can go forward with our field experiences. And since we each of us we spend a lot of time in that area, particularly in southwest region of Bangladesh. So we come up with like a question like what does an adaptation intensive region look like? Because we spend a lot of time over there, we saw a lot of interventions going on and people are being benefited throughout the process of adaptation, but then again there is no tangible progress uh, uh, in that region. So yeah, this is the place where actually we met everyone. So it's kind of like also special place for us as well, because this is the place where we met, where we started thinking about adaptation, and from where we get our idea of doing a research at that area. That is Satkira, Khulna, Bangladesh, which is the southwestern part in Bangladesh. Uh, so to look at this adaptation process over there, we wanted to use that lens, like the sustainability lens, where there is three pillars of sustainability. One is economic, and social. So we wanted to see the what is the dynamics in environment, in economy, in the society of that area. Uh, to see that, we wanted to go through the major spaces where actually intervention took place. The first one is over there is the freshwater access, because the area has a really problem regarding salinity issue, and they don't have the freshwater access. So the process has been taken over there since over 2 decades, starting with the ponds and filter, then rainwater harvesting and reverse osmosis. Now they came up with this technology of reverse osmosis, where they're desalinizing the water and having the fresh water. So in all of this process, we found out that intervention of an elite capture, which is like social dynamics, we found out, because there are a lot of cases we found that whether it is the ponds and filter or the rainwater harvesting place or the reverse osmosing, always there is a power influence. So the elite people in the society, they wanted to have the intervention installed nearby their houses so that they can access to that very easily. And also, who will get the access, who will not get the access, there is also the power influence. Not everyone can get it. So here we found it is also being elite capture. But another problem is that the most of the projects are very short time, are very short within the very short timeline. So after the project ends, it needs maintenance. It also has a cost of maintenance, like for cleaning, repairing, and replacing the equipment. So one thing that there is no modality of maintaining intervention even after the project ends. So there are a lot of ponds and filter we found out in the area which are now totally abandoned. No one is using that water from there, and also this sort of process is adding extra cost to the local community. In the reverse osmosis plant, particularly, they have to take an ATM card, like water ATM card, where they use that card for having the money, and they have to pay for getting water. So it can also uh, add add burden on the local communities where they don't have the economic stability in the face of climate change, and since they were experiencing lots of disaster and loss and damages due to the disaster. So, and also if using their money to get water, it can be also a burden for them as well. Along with that, the reverse osmosis plants produce wastewater that contains salt and or the chemical, which is really hazardous for the environment over there. It also affecting the biodiversity negatively. The the next thing is agriculture technique, where largely a lot of intervention is being taken place. One of them is salt tolerant rice variety. Another is most popular, which is shrimp and crab aquaculture, and also there is floating garden as well. In terms of social dynamics, we found that the salt tolerant rice has a larger grain that actually local community shared with us, and they don't like the taste of that salt tolerant rice because it's totally contradictory with the traditional rice they, which they normally have in their meals. Also, this intervention created social dynamics, like selecting the particular community of beneficiaries, because all of the projects has been taken to the ground. Uh, they always select a particular beneficiary in the community. They work with a particular group of people. Not everyone get connected with in this process. So, so it also creates the hierarchy and also create a social tension among the local people. And also, since stream culture and crab culture, which is very common over there, has been taking place, and it's replacing the agriculture. So it's also into uh, it also the causes of salinity intrusion in the area, and it's affecting people's health as well, particularly the women. There is a lot of research already are there where it shows that uh, women are being affected negatively by the uh, salinity. I mean, Raka can talk about it better, I think, because she has a paper on it, like how salinity is affecting the women health and hygiene. Another thing is the economic dynamics, which is like this intervention often create the new cost for the farmer because the new technology requires new fertilizer or new equipment. So it also adding an extra cost. Other than this, the shrimp and crab aquaculture is particularly damaging the agriculture since the people over there practicing agriculture uh, as their traditional way of earning livelihood, and also that shrimp and crab culture has been elite captured. So the people who are like rich, they started doing the shrimp culture and crab culture over there, and the poor people who was already vulnerable, and they have a small land of doing agriculture now. Since the shrimp and crab culture taking place over there, it creates the more salinity in the soil. They cannot do the agriculture over there, and in terms of environmental dynamics, so it's very like visible over there as well as the salinity erosion due to shrimp and crab culture affecting biodiversity. As the people who ever went to the Shatkhira and that coastal area, they will definitely see that there is less fresh water spaces over there now. Mangrove species is trying to get trying to be there, established there by themselves, but the other freshwater species like the fruit species or any other things, they're hardly be seen over there. The next is the flood protection. Of course, it's one of the major area where a lot of money has been is being invested, and the embankment is the one of the major one because it's always come up with the embankment whenever we talk to with the local community. They want a strong embankment, they want protection, they want protection of their houses, their assets, and for that to address this issue, they always want a strong embankment because, particularly in Gabor Union, I remember the people there was a broken embankment. People who were living over there, and they mentioned that several times they have to be inundated during flood and cyclone, and they were like, we need to have a good embankment over there. But these things also have a dynamics in the in the local context. Particularly, the embankment create division between the community because we have seen that a lot of people are inland, like they are staying inside the embankment. Some of the poor people who doesn't have land and are living, particularly living in the like government land, which is called caste land, they live outside of the embankment. So it clearly creates the differentiation between the poor people and the little bit wealthy people. So and also it creates the social hierarchy as well. Some um, some living area also suggested that drain had been built to protect from the flood over there, so that the water, they can get rid of the water logging during the flooding. But it is also seen, Daniel actually work on that area, that uh, all the drains are, most of the time the drains are has been built close to the influential and wealthy residents so that they don't get submerged during the flood. As well as embankment requires frequent repairs, and local people use their own time and labor and resource to do it because they wanted to protect themselves by any means. So before any disaster, when they got to know through the early warning system, that, and also they have the idea like when the disaster can come beforehand, they started repairing their environment by themselves without any supports. So it also needs time and labor of them. Yeah, if if they don't need to do this by themselves, they could have do anything else, and which maybe make some money for them as well. So this is the economic perspective of the having environment over there, and the drain also would have to be maintained over time. When the project ends, there is no like particular body or modality who will be maintaining the drain later on and excavate the canals or drains so that the water can be discharged by the time. In terms of environmental dynamics, which is now a lot of people is talking about it, that environments shift the natural flows of the rivers. So it actually shift the vulnerability from one place to another place, since riverbank erosion or the river waste is the natural thing. So where when we are placing an embankment somewhere, maybe we're protecting that particular place somehow, but the riverway with the greater velocity may affect the another region or somewhere else. So it's kind of like shifting the vulnerability from one place to another place. The drains both mosquitoes in that area, because most of the drain are less maintained and they always get clogged, and so mosquitoes get a really good home to reproduce. So it also affects the people health as well. A lot of people are getting affected by the mosquitoes over there. And the last but not the least is the finance, where mostly in Bangladesh, microcredit is being used to combat the climate change hazards and disasters. People take loan. Normally, we say that to combat the climate change, we have to have resilient livelihood. So people over there, they always, I'm sorry, sorry. So people over there, uh, they wanted to develop their livelihood. Uh, so in that case, since they don't have a lot of capital to do it, they took microcredit from different NGOs. There are a lot of NGOs that are working over there with this microcredit things. But we talked with a lot of people. One man particularly was mentioning that he took loan. He thought that he'll be investing that in a business, and then again another disaster came. He had some losses and damage. Then uh, he took loan again uh, from an NGO. Then again, in the next disaster, uh, he lost all of the money, all of his investment. So this is how it's going on in that area. Like people are drowning under debt but day by day, because they cannot pay back the loan, and which is clearly shows that they are stuck in the poverty cycle, intergenerational poverty cycle. They cannot, even though they are trying hard to go forward with their economic condition, but then again they are stuck in intergenerational poverty cycle. Also, we have seen that and heard the report that adaptive livelihoods that ultimately produce limited profits in that area. So far, we have seen, because also someone people are talking about the market linkage, like there in that area, shrimp and crab culture has a linkage with the international market, so that they can export their produces in international market as well. But we have seen during the COVID, all the export process was halted, and the people who had already invested a lot of money in their shrimp farm or crab farm, they could not sell their produces to the international market, and they had a big loss. So this sort of uncertainties and research always there in terms of international market or in this process. So even though maybe even though maybe eh, uh, they are earning a better livelihood, but then again there is lots of uncertainties and risks in future. So now actually I wanted to hand over the presentation to Daniel. That's all from my side. I think now Daniel will go in deeper with these problems, with these things, and how we summarize our research. So Daniel, over to you, and thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Renan. So, you can all hear me, right? Okay.
Yes, you
So
will.
I, so we know from the literature, there's been a lot of research on how existing approaches to adaptation have numerous shortcomings, sometimes even maladaptive effects. All of the issues or these issues have been identified at all stages of the adaptation project cycle. So what we're seeing ultimately are adaptation projects that do not lead to long-term resilience in communities. And that comes from the planning stage where economic value, so kind of like the contribution of the new activity toward national GDP gets prioritized over the effectiveness of the intervention. We've seen in the literature, scholars talk about how adaptation is added to existing development projects just to kind of make it more attractive. Camelia Dewan calls this climate spice added to development projects. In planning, also, kind of formal, non-local expertise is regularly prioritized over local interests and experiences. And then similar problems at the implementation and evaluation stages where there's short timelines, the projects are susceptible to exogenous changes. In the evaluation stage, there's not much evaluation after the project ends and no support, like Rana mentioned, after the project's end date to continue supporting the community to keep the project going. Next slide, please. Okay, so what happens when all of these problems that Rana described come together in an adaptation-intensive region, when all of the social and economic and environmental disruptions from all these projects come together? Next slide, please. So we argue that this produces something we call adaptation dynamics, and these are rolling waves of change in adaptation-intensive regions, which are brought on by these regular, overlapping, and intersecting implementations of adaptation projects in the same place. So these dynamics are produced when, for example, an organization comes into a community with a technical solution for freshwater access. That project ends 2 years later as the equipment falls into disrepair, and another organization comes in with climate resilient seeds for agriculture and plans to create a women-led community group. And then when that project ends and the seeds are abandoned by the farmers who can't afford them in the long term, and the women's group dissipates, another organization comes in with money for building a drain system through the community, and so on and so on. So this figure here depicts how in an adaptation-intensive region like Southwest Bangladesh, over time, all of these multiple actors are introducing different adaptations. So these are kind of the different waves and colors and gradients in the figure. And the short timelines, especially of these projects, only exacerbate these dynamics as the projects kind of intermittently appear and disappear, disrupting people's lives. Next slide, please. So these projects produce interconnected and compounding effects as they accumulate over time. In the paper, we include this figure. I know it's probably a little hard to read right now, but the figure highlights the different projects in the Southwest that we discussed earlier, that Rana discussed earlier, and shows how they collectively produce problems, which over time compound the dynamics produced by each project individually. So for example, reverse osmosis centers generate harmful wastewater, brackish aquaculture increases salinity, and embankments interrupt natural water and silt flows. And then individually, each of these projects has these impacts on the local ecology, but cumulatively, they can completely change ecosystems on which people depend for their livelihoods. If you, yeah, there we go. Can you click one more time? I'm going to zoom in on that little box section just so we can get an example. So we visually depict in this figure through the projects in the gray boxes and the social, economic, and environmental dynamics outlined in purple, red, and green, respectively, how these interconnections come about. So if you look here in the center is new rice varieties being introduced. That leads to effects in all three areas. So above it, financial insecurity, to the left, food habits, and below it, freshwater supply. You can see two wells also influence the freshwater supply. Aquaculture in the same area can further impact water supply as well, and impact soil salinity, which then can increase the need for new rice varieties, et cetera. And so you can kind of start to see how all of these things kind of compound on each other. There's also impact or these dynamics also lead people to take out loans, which can exacerbate financial insecurity. And over time, these things just build up and intersect and interact and disrupt people's lives further. Next slide, please. Okay, so by thinking with these adaptation dynamics, we're able to recommend changes to alleviate them and to reduce the disruptions that people are feeling, not only from the climate impacts, but from the projects themselves that are meant to reduce the climate impacts. And this figure represents the new approach. So this new approach would be one coordinated effort that gradually increases adaptation intensity over time according to evolving needs. So that's represented by the increasing gradient of the line from left to right. And it would also incorporate new solutions as local conditions and needs evolve over time, which is represented by those changing colors. Next slide, please. So in all, we recommend that adaptation projects must be reimagined to be more stable and effective. Projects should be aiming to reduce social, environmental, and economic disruptions, rather than like directly producing them as they're doing now, especially in the interest of sustainability over time. And we know adaptation is supposed to be helping people become more resilient in the long term. And all of this, local leadership should be at the core, because they know what's best and what's most needed and what's most appropriate in their areas. And practitioners overall must become aware of and concerned with the dynamics their projects produce, because right now they're not really being considered. And it's, as we've explained throughout this presentation, it's really impacting how people experience additional challenges in addition to climate change itself. And that is it. You can hit the next slide. So we thank you so much for listening to our presentation, and we look forward to the comments from Laura and Faisal, who will give us, or like raise some issues that they see and some thoughts that they have about this paper, and then we'll switch over to a broader Q&A if anyone from the audience wants to join the conversation.
Faisal, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, thank you, Daniel and Ronan. Excellent paper, excellent conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation. And Laura, thank you for allowing me to go first. So those, I don't know, those who don't know me, my name is Faisal. I work as a senior specialist with the Water and Urban team of the Global Center on Adaptation. But the colleagues that I represent here, I've been working with them for quite some time now. So I'm really glad to be here today. So Daniel, I was going through the examples and Ronan, how you have explained, I agree with most of these. And I kept remembering the Sarah Erickson's paper, forgetting the title, but this famous paper of adaptation trade-off and how at scale adaptation has not always produced the sort of deemed benefit it promises. So there you see they indicated that, well, adaptation often, if not considered properly, could lead to reinforcing existing vulnerability, which you highlighted with the power elite capture, with all these potential interventions, new interventions that are coming in. The second it does is the redistribution of vulnerability, again, which you were indicating that okay, with the pipeline or the drain, sometimes you put a drain in the to clear urban flooding within the city, but that means that okay, the water travels faster to basically introduce flooding to the adjacent urban areas. We also see all these potential projects like flood embankment or flood controlling project, which often displaces marginalized groups. So that is again another example of redistributing. The third is really introducing new challenges. And that is also very prominent in the examples that you shared. For example, I mean, with the reverse osmosis example that you shared, where you talked about the salinity but what they haven't thought through is the wastewater and then how that wastewater is going to be managed. The fact that okay, this is a concentrated brine with probably many of the pesticides and others that are being treated and then that are being removed from the water but disposed in an untreated manner. So that's introducing sort of a new challenge. So I think that particular those three aspects are very prominent in the examples that you shared. Where I really liked is you indicated that okay, there's these basically packets of potential adaptation solutions that are coming in. Now, in line with that, what I was thinking that maybe you could start raising the question that, okay, who decides what is the next wave going to be? What's the next wave going to be like? When there's more focus on water versus what's the focus on food? Right now, as you know, that everybody's talking about nature-based solutions. It took us a few years. And I mean, can we predict that, okay, what the next topic of interest is going to be? If you look at David Lewis's paper of that, okay, how these large entities, large investment or financing agencies look at is that they always try to sort of come up with new terminologies that are catchy or something that keeps them relevant. He used the term perpetual present. And then this is probably also very relevant to what you're saying, is that the adaptation dynamics is that related to these large financing or the donors, their priorities, or that kind of thinking. And then the other aspect, I think, which is also relevant is the techno-managerial aspect. I think Laura is going to focus on that because she has worked a lot on that. But there's this penchant for technical solutions. So you introduce something you don't often you don't see in the hindsight what sort of new challenges it's going to bring through. Here I want to say that, okay, not necessarily people introduce new technology with the bad intention, but they are often the potential consequences are either not often known, or the local knowledge is often ignored or not given as priority. For example, in Bangladesh, if you see in the 80s, when the groundwater wells were introduced, before that people were very much dependent on surface water, and a lot of people used to die out of diarrhea and waterborne diseases. So they introduced groundwater wells, only to realize after 15 years that we now have the arsenic problem, which is also deadly, right? So what I'm trying to say is that often it's not done with the wrong, or started with the wrong intention, but things can go wrong, and we should, if we, I mean, as science produce better, we can learn from past mistakes and be prepared that, okay, can we start thinking that, okay, what are the things that can go wrong? And if we, maybe we won't have the answer right away, but the research community then can help that, okay, these are the potential challenges that you can see or you can potentially encounter that might allow us to prevent some of those disruptions or that adaptation dynamics could bring in. That I had, I mean, this is where the funding also probably plays a role, is because wherever the funding, the projects, I mean, agencies, NGOs, and others, they also bring in projects that keeps them more relevant, that allows them to access more funding, and these donor agencies always find some local elites that are going to be behind their agenda, behind their support. So I don't really have an answer to how we can address this. But here I remember what Salim used to say, that, well, adaptation is an experiential sort of knowledge or a science. It's very hard to really know that, okay, what are the things that is going to go wrong. So to avoid that, what we could potentially, I think there are some principles that have been talked about adaptation principles, like do no harm, or make sure that, okay, people are not going to be worse off when they are. So if we sort of keep those principles in mind, like not just for the sake of keeping mentioning those, but rather really thinking through those principles, that, okay, are we going to make people more vulnerable, or what are the new dynamics this particular intervention is going to introduce? Can we see if there is an alternative way that can deliver, or are there existing lessons that can be learned from past initiatives? So those, I think, can allow us to probably mediate or lower the impacts of these adaptation dynamics. But I also agree, Daniel, what your last slide shows, that, okay, a coordinated approach of and a long-term approach might could also be usable. But this long-term approach, but I haven't seen adaptation or development industry coming out with a very long programmatic approach that hasn't worked, despite the fact that we've been talking about it. Maybe more discussion more sort of experiments done to understand that, okay, how programmatic approaches can deliver better as opposed to a projectized approach. I'll probably stop there. So thank you again, and I thought that this is a really interesting concept that you're putting forward. Thank you again.
All right, well, I think a lot of what I have to say hopefully builds on Faisal's comments, and I think this is just a really fascinating paper, and thank you so much for the great presentation. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Laura Kuhl. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and International Affairs program at Northeastern University in Boston, and had the pleasure of working with some of you that are here on this panel, but it's great to meet those of you that I haven't met yet. So I wanted to kind of continue the conversation and focus on kind of two things that I think are really important contributions of this paper. One is that sort of taking these concerns and really kind of, I agree with Faisal that this paper really does seem like it builds very directly on the paper by Siri Erickson, thinking about whether these adaptation projects are sort of increasing vulnerabilities or what those dynamics look like. But I think it really kind of focuses in on this question of like these very specific places, and obviously Bangladesh is one of them, but I think we can think about other places around the world where there's this concentration of adaptation projects. And I think this is going to become an increasingly important dynamic to be paying attention to as kind of more and more actors are engaging in the adaptation space and thinking about what happens in these specific locations where this is happening. And one of the things that as you were presenting, it was really making me think about is kind of the ways that people in these locations engage with these actors, and sort of the savviness of local actors around these projects, especially over time, and just reflecting on what does that do for this process. And it actually made me think about a project that I was looking at a really long time ago in Ecuador. And it was a coastal area, I think in some ways, somewhat similar to coastal Bangladesh. There was a lot of shrimp aquaculture and displacement of mangroves and significant impacts from El Nino in the region. And when we were talking to people in this region about their sort of adaptation needs, we got the most bizarre, consistent narrative. And it was the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And everyone had this story that was almost like they'd memorized exactly what this narrative of what their challenges were. And they'd categorize them into these four horsemen of the apocalypse, these four different challenges that came together into this crisis. And it was just a good reminder of how performative the articulation of vulnerabilities can become in contexts where people have a lot of experience articulating these vulnerabilities for outside actors. And so that's just something that I think is worth thinking through, how that then shapes what these adaptation strategies, and kind of if we're looking to think about coordination over time, how does this performability really impact that, that process? So that was kind of one thought. And then the other thing I really wanted to hone in on is this question of like, what might coordination look like? Because obviously, you really point to these unintended consequences, not just of individual adaptation projects, but of the ways that they intersect with each other in ways that have sort of negative long-term consequences. And so clearly, there's a need for better coordination. But I'm curious, and I'm sure you have thoughts on this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of the dangers of coordination, perhaps. And by this, I mean, and I'm obviously being potentially sort of intentionally a bit provocative here. what I think sometimes tends to happen as we think about coordination is that there's a danger that that leads to a more top-down approach to adaptation planning. And kind of this desire to centrally design and control the adaptation process, which we all know that that's problematic as well. And so I'm curious how to think about sort of balancing this need for coordination. I think this gets at some of the questions that Faisal was raising of like, who gets to decide what those next adaptation strategies look like? How do we anticipate ahead of time these longer term strategies? And I would worry that perhaps a call for coordination might lead to a push for large scale top down planning and a consolidation of power and control over adaptation. So that's kind of one concern. The other thought on that coordination question is I'm wondering if there's ways to almost take all of the problems that you've identified with this and could there, and this is going to be perhaps a naively optimistic take on this, is there a way to think about, are there potentials to not centralize coordination, but to really think of this almost as an innovation system where different projects and different actors are playing kind of very specific roles in individually advancing this collective goal. And so I'm thinking about kind of what are the different strengths the different actors bring to the adaptation table. There's a really different role for perhaps a grassroots NGO-led adaptation initiative compared to a large World Bank-funded infrastructure adaptation project. But arguably, there's a potential role that both could play. And so I'm wondering if this kind of framework of thinking about these consequences that build on each other, that you, I think, very articulately present the negatives of that, whether there's any ways that that might be able to be kind of flipped on its head and identifying synergies and ways that projects might be able to sort of collectively advance these goals. So I'll stop there. I feel like there's, okay, I won't stop quite there. I have one other thing, and this is perhaps a little bit of a small point in the paper, but I thought it was a really interesting point that came out of particularly the discussions on sort of finance. And that was, I feel like in addition to the increasing concentration of adaptation projects in these regions, I'm curious what your thoughts are on how adaptation intensity and loss and damage start to come together. And so going back to your example of kind of the credit, the microcredit and the loans and kind of the challenges that created for the success of adaptation projects, I'm curious, how do we start to think about these adaptation intensive regions in the context of loss and damage and how that starts to influence the way these dynamics play out? So now I'll turn it back to you guys.
But it's an excellent paper, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah,
Good
thank you
luck
so
with the
much.
rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to respond to the Laura's comments regarding coordination. So I think maybe Daniel, you can also add it. So initially, when we were just thinking about the coordination, we actually we thought that coordination needs to be from the ground. Like the example, most probably we have already put in our paper. That is, for example, in a village where one NGO is building one embankment, and another NGO is investing on floating garden. So, but they're working in different places. So where the NGO is establishing practicing the floating garden, there is no embankment, or there is maybe a broken embankment. So if there is a disaster, their investment in floating garden can wash away. But the project embankment project what is going on. If there is a coordination between two NGO, that one NGO is in building the embankment, and there the another NGO is investing on the floating garden, as well as now the people who are living on that area, they will get access to the loan, like, or microcredit, so that they have the protection, and if they invest their money over there, they can have the protection as well, and they have the less risk of losing everything. So that coordination we are actually trying to address in our paper as well. Like, the coordination should be on the ground, and all the practitioners who are trying to help the people, so they have to sit together and they have to come up with the idea that, okay, so we'll take that area, and we will all coordinate to develop this area anyhow in from our end. It's not like we'll be choosing our area by our own. So this is what we were thinking when we were writing the paper. I think Dinian killed it as well.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Ron. That's exactly what I was thinking of. And then in addition to that, I do share the concern that this could lead to more top-down, as like organizations kind of maybe become the ones that are like, oh, we need to coordinate for work in this area. And then that just, consolidates their power in making decisions on these projects. But I guess one of the main, there needs to be some way of making these efforts less fragmented, I guess is the best way I can put it. Like, so one of my major frustrations in trying to study adaptation projects in Bangladesh was that there's like absolutely there's no list, people don't keep track of what has taken place. It's really impossible to figure out, or unless you go kind of organization by organization and talk to people who are part of the project, like it's really difficult to figure out what's actually even been done, because once a project's gone, it kind of disappears, and people have moved on to the next thing, and no one knows what's sort of been done in this region before. So it's just, there's no communication of information. There's no knowledge sharing between, there's no really like deliberate and coordinated knowledge sharing between actors. You kind of just have this very fragmented, system of just random projects that are being thrown into villages in the same region as what you talk about. So, for sure, we need to think about how to do coordination properly and not consolidating the top-down powers that are making decisions. As Renan was saying, like focusing this at the local level, or like taking it place and coordinating around a place, and seeing the different initiatives that need to happen there can also be, I think, combined with more locally led approaches. And if we're, again, thinking in the longer term, even though, as like Faisal mentioned, you're not going to know what like the next thing is that people are concerned about, or like that donors want to prioritize. But I also think we need to like reframe our thinking on that, where it's like all of the priorities are coming from people who are in these places. There's like, I think maybe this is about what you were suggesting, Laura. Maybe there is like a coordinated team of people who have different roles in actually executing the adaptation, but that this is something that's not just like planned according to changing donor priorities, because that's what's producing these dynamics, but instead is something that's kind of coming from the bottom up in like one coordinated effort where we have people playing different roles. I'm going to pause because I was just talking for a bit. Is there anything anyone else wanted to respond to? Or I have some other responses if not. Rock or run on? No. I can bring up one more thing. Let me see. So I'm looking back at the questions that you all posed. The question that you posed, Laura, of how people in these locations are engaging with actors, I think there is like a level of performance. I think Raka might be able to speak to this a little bit more, maybe Ranon as well, because they have more experience working at the local level. I've studied the organizations a bit more, but I think that is, there's certainly a piece of that. I think it's maybe related also to like training that they've received from NGOs on how to present themselves in order to get resources that they might need or want. I guess I don't have too much to say on that, just that there needs to be I think that's indicative to me of like a lack of trust really between the local people and the NGOs, that they kind of just need to like say what they need to say in order to get it. They don't think that the NGOs are actually going to help them beyond just like the provision of whatever resources they can for a few years. So I'd be curious to hear what Rocket and Ronan have to say about that as well. But I will just mention in regard to your loss and damage question. I mean, I think this is like a hugely connected to loss and damage. I think when you have projects that are producing maladaptive effects ultimately over time, I mean, that's loss and damage, and it's not directly from climate change. That's from our efforts to do something about climate change. And that's really, I mean, in terms of climate justice, that's the opposite of climate justice. You have organizations that are supposed to be providing finance and solutions, and instead are making things worse for local people and making things more uncertain. So that's something that's not considered really in loss and damage discussions right now. Obviously, with like the loss and damage fund that's been created at the UNFCCC level, there's the possibility that these kind of cycles get just reproduced, because like, what is this finance going to go toward if it's not going to be kind of project based in this way? Because we have adaptation finance right now. That's what's what's fueling a lot of the projects that we're talking about in these approaches. And we haven't really attempted to come up with a better way of distributing finance for climate change yet. So it'll be interesting to see what the Loss and Damage Fund does on that. And I think there's a huge case to be made, especially given what we highlight in this work, that we need to do something differently, and that we need to also consider that adaptations can contribute to loss and damage in ways that we're not really currently acknowledging. But I'll pass it over to maybe Raka and Ronan if either of you have comments.
Ronan, did you want to go first?
You can go first. Yeah.
I mean, Danielle said most of what I would have shared, but I think one of the like really like when we were writing this paper, what I really liked about it is that it like truly felt like a collaboration. And like I think one of the most generative moments was when we were like trying to define the concept of adaptation dynamics, and we couldn't figure out how it was different from maladaptation. Like we were just like it was like every time we were trying to like figure out how they were different, and we knew that they were, we just like kept being like, okay, but like everything that you do on the ground, like that you see in terms of development projects, like they all have these like huge maladaptive effects. And it was interesting because I think that the way we started to like really reconcile that was like to take one step back and look at the project, like the process a little bit bigger, and think through like, okay, like I mean, I know that Danielle and I are really inspired by Rebecca Elliott's piece about like how the sociology of climate change is the sociology of loss, and like thinking through the material losses that people are experiencing, but also like thinking like more deeply about like the way that adaptation is tied to those losses, and like that like in some periods of time, like living with adaptation intensity means that you have so much access to so many different resources, but at sometimes you're just living in the ruins of all of these like failed adaptation projects too, right? And like how does the experience of like living through those phases really affect your life? And I think that like what I really like about this concept that like Ronan really like brilliantly came up with is like thinking through how broadening your temporal lens really helps with like this way of thinking about loss or like climate loss like slightly differently. Um, yeah, that wasn't a fully formed thought, but that was what I found really generative about the process.
Ronan, did you want to add, or should we open it up?
I don't know, like I feel like that everything has been covered. I don't know what to add more in that case. Uh, but yeah, thank you, Laura, from my end. Like your comments and questions was really insightful for us, and we can start our our research in different dimension as well. Like you mentioned about the loss and damage, the ways and the coordination. How actually we didn't really thought about it, how the coordination will work. We just give a recommendation, but now it's the new it's a new era, or it's a new place to explore. I think like how it will work in the future. We just say that okay, this is the adaptation dynamics, but then again we have to like took it forward, like, okay, how to assess all the dynamics and how to consider all the dynamics and how to address all these dynamics on the ground. Yeah, I think that's all for me.
Can I just respond to something Raka said? Um, I appreciate your candor about sort of the process of thinking about these adaptation dynamics and kind of the relationship with maladaptation. And I just want to say, I thought that this was a really helpful concept that really is quite different from just maladaptation. And I think that this kind of that you're really onto something about these experiences over time of people with the sort of repeated projects, because I don't think it's just limited to the ways the projects themselves intersect. I really think that, as kind of you've titled this session, that the lived experiences of being in these adaptation intensive regions is really important to be capturing and hasn't been part of the conversation enough. So just wanted to sort of thank you again for that contribution.
Can I just, oh,
I was
Raka,
so
did you?
I was just like so excited to respond that I forgot to say thank you for your comments. They were really helpful. It's like furiously typing notes over here. But yeah, like thinking with both you and Faisal today has been, I think, really generative. And like this paper is like now through like going through the submission process. But I think when we get it back for reviews, like there's a lot of things I would like want to incorporate from this discussion. So it's been really, really generative.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I also want to highlight, especially since I know there are some young researchers in the audience, that as Laura highlighted earlier, this is something that we don't think is only happening in Southwest Bangladesh. This is like a prime case and obviously one that we were all familiar with, but we hope that the work is taken up and these concepts can be useful in other places as well. And I mean, this is also, this is a conceptual paper. We would love to see more empirical work that can kind of speak to the lived experiences that we're referencing here and actually talk to people about their experiences in these adaptation intensive regions. So this is a little pitch for the young researchers out there to maybe consider taking these ideas up in future projects. I think it would be a really interesting way of demonstrating kind of some of the like big picture ideas that we're bringing up in this paper.
Yeah, I mean, just to reinforce that, what you've been presenting resonates a lot with work that I've done in Central America and also Ethiopia. So I mean, I do think this is a concept that will carry very well to different locations.
Do we want to open up to the audience? Raka, do you want to moderate that? Or?
Yeah, I'm happy to. We don't have any questions yet, but does anyone want to submit any to the question Q&A section?
If someone have any question, they can just type it in the chat
Raise
box.
their hand too.
While people are typing their questions, I have one more question for you guys. And feel free to leave it if you get questions in the chat. But I'm really curious if you have any thoughts, because you also raised, and we haven't talked about this question of like what some of the long-term monitoring and evaluation approaches could be that might help to address some of these concerns. Because I mean, I think you're absolutely right that these, like, there isn't a lot of long-term evaluation, and when it is, it's very focused on sort of project level targets. So I'd be curious if you have any kind of reflections or insights on that piece too.
Oh, go ahead, Dana. I think I can like briefly start because I think that this is also like again something that we talked a lot about in the process of writing the paper. Because at one point we had like made our discussion section like kind of like policy insights or something like this is how you should do development. And then we like scaled that back because in some ways like adaptation intensity and like asking for coordination across projects really helps us like to think through some of those, but also in some ways it shows you like how broken the system is, right? Like that we need like larger or different changes. So like even if monitoring and evaluation processes are perfect, like where does that get us? Or like how does that like help? Like because we have another diagram in there that I don't think we showed today, which is that the like the like outcome is like just like kind of a flat dynamic where things are like not so like up and down. But we talked a lot about like what that flat dynamic means. And does that mean that there's no projects happening, or does that mean that the projects are coordinated and like kind of like calming these waves down of like how much variation people experience throughout like years or decades? So I think that like monitoring and evaluation, the way that we thought about it was like one part of like keeping these projects coordinated together over time and to like calm those waves. But I think we were also trying to use this paper, or like maybe this is just like how I'm thinking about it, but like to think a little bit about how to like maybe move away from like the like single development project view of like this like adaptation intensive region, and instead like how to think through, and like a lot of my work looks at like the everyday adaptations of people and how those are aggregating to social changes that like people don't see anyway, that we don't see if we like just take the top down view. So like given that that's my lens, like I think thinking through what might like calming that wave like also leave space for communities to do for themselves, or what support might they ask for the, like their own like locally led adaptations in various ways.
Yeah, and just to add on to that a little bit, right, I mean, right now we know that these projects are happening mostly through like the like log frame approach, where it's like an organization sets a bunch of goals, and often those are what we call outputs rather than outcomes. And so it's like things that you can say like, oh, we did X number of meetings with the women in the community, or we install, it's a lot of quantitative, like, oh, check mark, did we do these things, did we install the tube well, did we, and it's not really like these more qualitative longer term assessments of the actual impacts that these projects may have on a community, whether they actually build resilience, and like whether they cause these dynamics and issues that over the long term that we're identifying here. So I mean, this has been a call at the international level as well for more qualitative and quantitative understandings of adaptation effectiveness. I think this is something that qualitative researchers have a really great opportunity to contribute to informing how this takes place. But also, I think all of this fundamentally, as Rocco was saying, like needs to be based in like community understandings of local understandings of what is effective and what is a positive change and what makes them more resilient. Because adaptation experts are not always going to know what actually like what good change actually means, or like what adaptation actually means. And also, I mean, this also ties into our recommendation that this needs to be much longer term thinking. I mean, if you have things like you need something, an intervention to be flexible over the long term, or you need to be able to make changes as things change. I mean, weather patterns might change over time, so that the original agricultural intervention that you helped build, even if it was great and was coordinated, it might not work in 10, 15 years. That's the nature of climate change. So we need systems where it's like monitoring, but not monitoring and evaluation, where it's like, oh, check, 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 did we do these things? But something where it's like kind of more regular assessments where it's like, okay, we need to pivot, or like maybe something different would be useful here, or we need to rethink this, and there needs to be the flexibility and support, especially financial support, to do that over time. Did we get any questions, or how are we doing? All right.
We didn't get any questions, but Ronan, I kind of wanted to hear like in response to like Laura's question about like elaborating a bit on like the local experience. I kind of wanted to hear your perspective on it.
Uh, can you come again? I'm sorry, I missed it. Like the question, can you come again?
I think she's referring to the question that I posed around kind of how this lived experience of being in an adaptation-intensive region shapes the way that people engage with projects as they're happening.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I think that was the fundamental thinking of our research. Like, that was the first question that came up in our mind. Like, since the external donors or the NGOs and they're coming up in the adaptation, like in the region, and they're saying that, like, if we just think about the initial stage of the adaptation, which is very top down, like, okay, I came up with this idea and the new technology, and it will help you, and people started doing that using that technology or all the intervention stuff. And so they did it, and it didn't work out. They took another one. So the first question that came in our mind, that do people actually uh, enjoying that changes, the transformation of adaptation, or they're tired of it, they're bored of it, they're just grabbing that opportunity because they have some sort of like benefit out of the project. The people who get selected as a beneficiary, maybe they are having some monetary support or any other logistical support. So in that case, they were saying that, okay, fine, I'll be doing this. But after the project ends, when the NGOs is went away, it clearly shows that they don't really accept that all the new technology or the new intervention. They started living as they used to live before. So that was the main I think the point that we came across when we start thinking about the adaptation dynamics. And then we started thinking about that, okay, all the projects normally very short timeline, it doesn't sustain. And when uh, the frequent adaptation project is coming in the same place, with they're working with different beneficiaries of different group of people, or with the same people, because there's also very common in the coastal area, the NGOs workers work with the same group of people, and it's not very large number. It's a very limited number, maybe 50 people, 50 household. So it also creates social hierarchies, like also the social tension, I think, as well as because it's very common in the rural Bangladesh that some people are getting benefited, other people, the people who are not getting benefited, they have kind of like a jealousy that these people have the better connection with the NGO. That's why they're getting benefited, but we don't have the connection with the NGOs, and we don't have. That's why we're not getting benefited. So it creates a tension among the local community as well. So uh, uh, for example, if I just given an example, it's not in the southwest part. I went with Dawe, which is another co-author of our paper. So it's in the north central part. So we're researching on that area. So we found out a village where Muslim community and one ethnic community live together. Just uh, there is a road, and one side of the road there all the Muslim are living, and another side of the road all the Hajung community is living over there. So when we first stepped into the area, they thought that we are NGO worker and we went there to support the people, and that's why we're looking for people to talk. Uh, First, we went to the Hajong area and we talked with some people over there, like with women and men as well. Then we moved to the Muslim area. And, one old man, he started yelling at us that, why did you come here? You should have come over there. Because then he actually speak out that all the uh, aid or all the assistance that comes, it always goes to the ethnic community, since they're minority. But in the naked eye, we could say that all the Hajim community peoples have the brick house, or at least a good house, like tin house, and the Muslim community over there, they have a really like very broken house or very damaged house. But then again, all the practitioners or all the NGO, when they are with the aid, they distributed them to the Hajim community. And so because they are ethnic minority, they can flag that their project as that very inclusive way. So, but then again, they have to, I think, feel like that they have to address also the vulnerable, who are the most vulnerable over there. And also, I feel like that this is the problem when uncoordinated projects are going on the ground. So they are not. It's not actually like whole of a society approach. It's kind of like working with the group of people. So if it was a whole of a society approach, then everyone would have been included in this project, and everyone would have been benefited according to their status. So then uh, it would not create that tension among the community, among the society. So beforehand, maybe where there was no NGOs over there, where if there was no adaptation um, projects or anything else, they might be living in a harmony. But when we came up with the idea, we are coming with like we're helping you out in a different manners, and we actually unintentionally creates a tension among the local community. So there are a lot of example, I think, like this. So this is how we are making a mess in the local community, and everything is uh, being so out of the hand. So that's why we wanted to actually address all these dynamics all together, because it's a mess actually, and we cannot actually totally ignore all the mess, but I think somehow we can minimize all the mess. So this is what we're looking for in future. I think all other researchers out there, they'll also be using our terminology and use like our concept, adaptation dynamics, and uh, we can work on it later on as well.
Thanks, Ronan. That was really helpful. We don't have any more questions. I think we can wrap up here. But I want to thank both Professors Laura and Faisal for coming and for giving us some great comments, and then for Danielle and Ronan for this amazing presentation, and everyone who is in the audience for the conversation, and ICAD for organizing. I hope to see you guys at some of the other Gobeshona panels.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you, Rock, as well. Thank you, Laura.